All right, welcome everybody. My name is Jared Wallace. I'm a regional manager for Sprague Pest Solutions, and I cover Eastern Washington State, state of Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. With me today is Jeff Weier. He's our technical director emeritus. Worked with Sprague for, I don't know, 37-ish years or something like that. Today we're going to talk about stored product pest. The unwanted guest for food processors. Oh, I'm sorry. I jumped ahead a little too quickly. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section. You'll see the button there at the bottom of your screen for questions that we'll answer at the end of the presentation. All right, a little bit about Sprague. We are a family-owned and operated company since 1926. We have currently 19 offices covering, I think, 9 states. You can see there in the red. We have teams that live and work in the communities they serve. So we actually have, in most areas where we operate, we have technicians that live in their communities. We have brick and mortar buildings, and have a strong support network available for our teams in the field. We have a global vision with local execution, like I just mentioned. Some of the smallest communities out there, we are completely represented and have a very quick response time. We have a commitment to quality and are also a commercial only company. So it allows us the freedom to focus on one thing and not being distracted with everything that goes with residential pest control. So we are one of the few commercial only pest control companies in America. All right, a few of the industries that we serve. So agriculture, commercial property, distribution and storage, education, food processing, retail and grocery, healthcare, hotels, resorts, housing, and restaurants. And these are all industries that can be affected by stored product pest as well. Okay, some of the products affected by stored product pests are, which most of you probably are aware of, pet food is a big one. Seed, anything from vegetable seed, grass seed, beans, any seed can be affected by stored product pest. Any baked goods, as most of those have grain products in them. Spice production, dried fruits, flour mills, as I mentioned before, grain, retail, grocery, warehousing and storage, and definitely nuts as well, are all products that are affected by stored product pests. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Weier.
Well, hello, everybody. Let me go back one page here. Okay. As Jared said, I've been in the industry for a while. I've been in total over 47 years in the industry. I've been working on stored product pests for a large portion of that time. I find stored product pests to be fascinating. They are just amazing animals. So you might want to ask yourself, what makes a stored product pest a pest? First of all, you can look at the types of products they're found in. So I have some pictures here, anywhere from grains, like in this grain pile in the middle, beans, peas, lentils, normally drier, durable products, durable goods, nuts, dried fruit, spices in the middle here. This is a nice picture from a Middle Eastern spice market. Amazing stuff there. And then in finished goods, they also will carry over into finished goods, like pasta is another thing. In fact, there's an interesting case where pasta, although it's a processed food, will actually host insects that are normally only found in grains. And these insects, because the pasta has been reformed in a solid form, these insects can almost mistake it for a grain, and they'll burrow in. These grain-boring weevils will bore into this pasta and complete their development inside pasta. It's a very unusual situation for a processed food. One thing we want to know is where the insects are. When you're looking at a problem, we'll talk about that a little further in my presentation about where we find these insects and what type of situations they're in. But there's two basic areas where you can find stored product pests. They can be in the commodity itself. So if you have a bin of stored wheat, you have insects infesting the wheat. You can have this bag of rolled oats in the top picture here, and there's insects infesting that bag of rolled oats. Or you can also have insects in the building or the equipment that are actually living on dust and product spillage and accumulation. At the bottom here, we have a picture of a motor I took in a plant. And look at those little tracks you can see coming out of from underneath the electrical conduit box. And there are stored product pests living underneath this on the dust that accumulated in there and coming out there. So it's very important that you understand you have totally different treatment strategies in many cases, depending on whether it's the product that's infested or your structure that's infested or your equipment that's infested. Right. So there are hundreds of stored product pests worldwide. Probably 30 or 40 are very relatively common, but there are lots of different things. So you want to ask yourself, what makes a stored product pest a stored product pest? You can say, well, I have ants. Ants get into my mill and are feeding on some of the flour. Are those a stored product pests? And I would say no. And because one of the definitions I use is that a stored product pest is an insect or other arthropod that actually lives and completes its life cycle inside the commodity itself or inside the food itself. Now, again, I mentioned earlier about the living in the equipment, so that's kind of you might think that's a challenge, but I think the stored product pests are still living and completing their life cycle, feeding on the food product. Whereas something like an ant will live outdoors in the nest and come in and feed off of your product or some other type of product. So that's one of the big differentiators for stored product pests, that they're living and completing their life cycle inside the commodity or inside the spillage or inside the accumulation of the dust or commodity in the facility. So let's examine the food chain. Now, normally in a stored product pest talk, we would look at, well, let's talk about the Indian meal moth. Let's talk about the red flower beetle, and let's talk about its biology and how many young it has and how many eggs it lays and how long it lives. But I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to take a different approach. I'm going to examine the food chain, because really there's a procession of insects in some cases from different stages of the food chain. So the food chain I've illustrated here starts out in the field, and I illustrate that with a nice almond orchard in bloom. These are beautiful things to happen. Almonds are a crop that can be infested by stored product pests at various stages. And also, you could think of a wheat field or a corn field or any number of places where the products are produced. Well, once these products are produced, they're harvested, they're put into a storage in some cases. They may not go directly to processing, they may go into a storage. These are some farm storage bins. This product is stored in those bins. Now, you might have one type of insect might infest in the field, and many of the insects that we're dealing with as stored product pests don't necessarily infest the product in the field, only after it's been harvested and then brought into the storage areas when the infestations usually start. And because what happens is, you think about it, these insects all originally developed as insects that lived out in the wild. They fed on the seeds in the grassy fields. They fed on things they would find. They were scavenger insects or different things out in the seeds naturally growing in the wild. Well, when man started growing food or harvesting food and bringing it together and storing it, oftentimes it's attributed to ancient Egypt or even earlier times. These insects found a bountiful area for them to move into. Rather than trying to have to forage from grass plant to grass plant to find the seeds to eat, they just went into the storage bin and fed on it there. So that's where these insects originally come from. And that's why when we bring the food together, we provide a perfect environment for them. Well, even more importantly, we go to the processing. This is a picture from a flour mill. There's also other types of processing. You might have a husking and hulling operation for nuts. You might have other types of situations for cleaning for beans and rice and different things. But this is where the material is actually processed. And when you look at it, what happens during processing is these seeds, grains, and beans tend to be broken down or have their protective coverings removed. And when that happens, they're exposed they are provide a better food source for insects that prefer that type of food. So basically, an insect that in the field could only feed on something that was damaged or blown down by the wind or broken. When we do this for them, they have an easier time getting into it. So we actually, by processing our foods, we are making it more accessible to these stored product insects. The next link on the chain would be to the food assembly, where we take these processed commodities and put them together. So we take flour and mix it with some spices and make a bread mix, or we might make a cake mix or something else. We might take the nuts and make almond milk out of the almonds. We might do a number of things to create a different product out of the raw ingredients. And again, in that process, we are further breaking it down and making it more available in many cases for the insect pests. So what we do is we make the product more available to the insects. So and you're going to see a progression of insects. Some insects will make it to the storage stage, but don't really do very well beyond that stage. Other insects join the chain of the food processing and are more successful in these other chains. Then after we've assembled the food into this final product, we put it into a warehouse, this nice big empty warehouse picture I have here. And stored, and maybe stored for several weeks, several months, or in some cases even years, where it's stored in these warehouses. Well, what it's doing there is it's as this food sits, it's more and more available and susceptible to insects infesting it. So many of the same insects that will infest the food in the food assembly or the milling stage will also infest it in the warehouse stage. Some won't, but some will. They find their way into that building. And we'll talk about how that happens. And then finally, when it leaves the warehouse, it goes out to the retail environment. Before it goes into somebody's home, it goes into a store, and it's on the shelves. And in those areas, we may not have good rotation. We may bring insects from the warehousing into this environment, or this environment, insects may enter the food in this final environment. So again, we have multiple stages of exposure, and this doesn't even talk about the transportation between these different steps. Anytime we take the food commodity and put it into a truck, whether it be a tanker truck with the flour going to the food assembly situation, or whether it be in a boxcar or a truck trailer or a container going to the warehouse. All of those are additional steps where insects can be introduced. There have been many situations I've run into over the years where a perfectly clean and food product without any insect activity has been put into a truck trailer that had an infestation of insects actually living in the truck trailer. And those insects moved into that product, and it showed up in the warehousing or even in the retail environment from that. And it wasn't the fault, or it wasn't the origination that was not in the food assembly or the milling or processing. It was in the transportation between these different stages. So we have to be careful at all stages of the food processing and food handling environment. So let's look at pests that infest crop. So a lot of, most are not of concern to us if we're dealing with processed food. We have things like the pea weevil, this down below here. This infests peas in the field. It does not reinfest them in storage. So it can be brought into the storage in some situations, but generally it will not continue, the infestation will not grow in a storage environment. We have the navel orangeworm moth on the right-hand side, lower right here. That is a moth that does a lot of damage to nut crops in the field and some fruit crops. But again, it only infests in the field. It does not overwinter in storage. It does not reinfest in storage. So if we see these moths, we know that they're not an infestation that's forming inside the processing or storage facility. Then I have up in the upper left-hand corner an Angamaw grain moth, which is a internal feeding moth, a very interesting insect. It has been known to infest corn and other products in the field. Again, when they get to reach a drier stage. We don't see a lot, in my experience, I don't see a lot of Angamaw grain moth in the northern tier of states. It's generally considered a southeastern United States pest. However, you may occasionally find it. It's noticeable by, you can see it spins a little silken cap over the entry point into the grain when it infests it. And then on the upper right, we have the lesser grain borer. These tend to infest the product once it's been harvested, because when the grain's in the field, it's a little bit protected. But there are situations where this insect can get into the grain when it's still in the field. Not very often, but it does happen. And they're very strong flyers that can move around from the fields to the storage area. Only infest in the storage. Let's move on to the storage pests. So there's a lot more pests in the storage environment, right? These are pests that take advantage. We actually invite these in by concentrating their resources in one spot. It makes a perfect environment for them to survive. So we have the lesser grain borer up in the upper right-hand corner. Again, we mentioned that might be in the field, but it is much more important pest in the grain storage. This insect lays its eggs on the outside of the kernels of the grain. The larvae hatch, and they burrow into the kernels of grain and live their life out inside the kernel of grain, whether it be wheat or barley, primarily wheat products. Now, at the lower left-hand corner here, we have the granary weevil. That's a true weevil because it has its proboscis or snout sticking out the front of it. This insect, like the lesser grain borer, infests whole grains, wheats, barley, even rice. There's a rice weevil that infests rice. What this weevil does, it chews a hole and lays its egg in that hole in the grain, and then the larva hatches and emerges and lives its life out inside that kernel of grain. Above that, in the middle, we have the bean weevil or cowpea weevil, different species. They will feed on pulses and beans, and they generally glue their eggs to the outside surface of the bean. And you'll see these little white specks on the beans, and the larva hatches, burrows directly into the bean. Now, these bean weevils will not infest the grains, and the granary weevils generally do not infest the beans. There's not much crossover in those areas. Then we have ones that feed on broken down grains. We have the rusty and flat grain beetle up in the upper left-hand corner here. This is a very small insect, which is very common, one of the most common pests in Canada of stored grain. It can be infest the stored grain. It also is related to fungus growth in many cases. So if you have a lot of moisture in the grain and there's fungus growing or hot spots in the grain, you might get this type of insect. The lower right is the red flower beetle. That's a important pest of flour, but it also can feed on broken down grain. It does not attack undamaged grain. But when these other insects like the lesser grain borer get in and damage the grain, you can have secondary infestations of the red and confused flower beetles. So after that, it goes to the processing, and we have some of the same pests. We have the red flower beetle, extremely common pest in flour milling. It's also a pest in the almond industry. They are massive numbers. They grow in the husks from the shelled almonds, and they can be a big nuisance in some of the processing facilities. We have the Indian meal moth, becomes a common pest in these milled environments. It's a scavenger moth, creates a lot of webbing, can clog up. It can cover up the tops of the storage bins. It can clog up machinery if it's there in heavy amounts. Up on the upper right is the almond moth, which is a different species, very similar but different species. All the moths in almonds are not almond moths. The Indian meal moth is probably the most common moth we see infesting nuts, but the almond moth is a different species which can be found. I generally see if anything, about 10% or less of the moths we capture are almond moths, whereas 90% of moths in any of these milling or processing situations are Indian meal moths. Indian meal moths also love beans, like garbanzo beans, they love to feed on those in the storage environment. We see a lot of those in those situations. The lower right is the warehouse beetle. There's a new appearance for this one you're seeing. This beetle is a very common living outdoors. It lives there's in large numbers on the outside, feeding on pollen in plants and flowering plants, sagebrush, other flowering plants. Then it's a strong flyer, will fly into a building and lay its eggs on. It prefers high protein products, but it can also feed on most milled grains and other materials. It likes things like, it's very common pest on powdered milk, powdered eggs, these types of high protein materials. And it can be a dangerous pest because its larvae are covered with hairs that can cause intestinal irritation and can cause illness in people that consume these accidentally. So this is the one stored product pest actually that can cause illness in a human. The other ones don't really cause any illness. They might be unpleasant if you know you're eating them, or if you don't know you're eating them, they probably don't make the difference. Now the flower beetles in some cases can produce some products called quinones, which when there's too much of this in the flour will affect the leavening of bread. So flour that's been infested with these beetles and contains some of these quinones is not often suitable for bread baking. Then we go to food assembly. Again, we have crossover. We have the Indian meal moth. We have the red flower beetle and confused flower beetles. We'll move over to these areas. And we have the warehouse beetle can be found in these situations. We've added a couple more here. The one at the bottom is the cigarette beetle, a very common and important pest. This is a important pest of spices. It loves leafy vegetables, dried vegetable materials, dried spices like oregano, thyme. It loves red peppers. It loves chili powder, all these types of things. It can also feed on, it's also known to feed on flour. When I see this beetle in a flour-based product, it's generally a mixed product that contains, a lot of spices in it to kind of sweeten it for it. And this beetle is also very interesting because it's one of the only beetles that can consume tobacco, one of the only insects, because it contains microorganisms living in its gut, kind of like termites do, that digest, that will detoxify some of the toxins. So you'll find this beetle in all these traditional products that people recommend for pest control, things like garlic, onions, in the powders, in the peppers, the various capsaicins. This insect can easily live on those products because of these same symbiotic microorganisms which detoxify the materials. Up in the upper middle here, we have the sawtooth grain beetle. This is an important pest. It can feed on flour, but it's not often found in flour. This tends to be found in more coarsely milled products like rolled oats, corn meals. You also find it in pet food a lot. It can also be found in dried fruits and, interestingly, chocolate products. So nuts and chocolate, you'll find this beetle in also. So you think about it, you're looking at their granolas and trail mixes are very susceptible to this type of insect. So again, we have different food preferences as well as where they show up. We move along to the warehousing, and again, we still have the Indian meal moth is a very, very good scavenger. It can live in lots of different environments. So we see this very often. Warehouse beetles we find in warehouses. That's why it's called the warehouse beetle. It does fly in from the outside in most cases, although it can be transferred, from a processing environment if you have infested food into a warehouse. But often this will fly right into the doorway through a vent. The most common way some of these flying insects get into our warehouses and food processing environments is through ventilation fans that aren't properly screened, or air makeup units or ventilation systems in general that don't have the filtration system intact, or it's not maintained properly. They will find their way in. We have found living infestations of these insects inside the ductwork of a ventilation system. Cigarette beetles do that often. They tend to get into the deepest, darkest corners and they're a very sticky pest that gets in and it's hard to get out. And I have found full infestations of cigarette beetles living in the ductwork of an air makeup system. So that's one important pest there. And again, they like the dried vegetable materials. They're strong penetrators. They'll chew through bags, chew through plastic containers, can do a lot of damage that way. And again, the sawtooth grain beetle, we can see that. I see that from time to time showing up in warehousing. You'll find it in the spillage on the rack legs. If there's spillage, bags break, you get spillage in floor cracks or rack legs. Those are important places to look in warehousing because the product sits there for a period of time and you can get lots of different insects actually living and breeding inside of that area. Finally, the retail environment. And the retail environment is just, in some sense, a smaller version of the warehousing environment. However, warehousing environments, often the product gets rotated very well because people are paying attention to it. But in the retail environment, you get slow moving products that will tend to become much more infested than some of the other products. So again, we have the Indian meal moth, which is a very good pest. Cigarette beetles are commonly found in grocery stores or retail environments. Sawtooth grain beetle, pet food areas, look at the rolled oats, look at all those types of areas. And another pest I put in here were the grain mites. And this is a relatively new pest showing up. We're finding a lot of grain mites in the retail environment. They tend to like moisture food products. So there's been a lot of new pet foods coming out that have a moisture component. They're not the dry kibble, they're a little moist. There are other types of materials. You can get into the jerky products, you can get into other candies and other things where these mites will find their way in. And they're so small, they're really not visible, but you see them as, it looks like almost a dust on the shelf when you move product off the shelf or from around the shelf. You'll see this dust-like material, which actually are the mites. So again, you can see from this series of images that we have gone from a relatively small number of insects, and then the composition of the group has changed, but there are as many carryovers from one to the other. So we can see this movement. These insects can infest de novo from the new at the site where they're found, or they can also be transferred from one site to another, from a processing plant to a warehouse to a retail environment. But often they arise from the new. They fly into the building through an open door, through an air duct, and get in there and infest the product that's in that environment. And what we do as we concentrate the food in the storage environment, as we break it down and make it more available and almost pre-digested for these insects, we make it more and more attractive and susceptible to these insects as we move through the system. Okay. Now I can turn it back over to Jared to talk about some of the control measures we can look at. Or do you want me to cover this one? We do talk about, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Got it?
That's you still, Jeff.
Okay. So some of the control measures we use that I think are very of interest are mating disruption, which is a tool that we use using the pheromones for the insects, using their own biology against them. We also have there's a tendency to have a lot of organic material, organic food, certified organic food processed. And there are different ways of attacking a pest problem in an organic environment. The key component to an organic environment is that you don't want to simply go in there and try to change one list of pesticides for another. Organic is a different approach. Organic, you're relying less on pesticides and more on sanitation, environmental modifications, and mechanical changes to prevent the pests. So it's a lot of more prevention, and using pesticides as a last resort. Even the so-called organic or national list products should be used as a last resort in organic program. And the most successful organic programs use a lot of other non-chemical, non-pesticidal measures to control the insects. We can use temperature control. We know that stored product pests become very less active below about 60 degrees, depending on the species. Some mites tend to do better at cooler environments, but most of them don't do very well below 60. So just keeping your environment cooler can help can help control the insects and reduce the activity. Monitoring is really important. You want to know, because you can't see what's inside the bags of the product or the boxes, you can use the pheromone monitoring to capture these insects. It's very effective in certain insects, especially the Indian meal moth, cigarette beetles, and warehouse beetles, for detecting the activity before you can actually see the damage. And that can help you determine if there's an issue in your facility, and that you can take steps to deal with it. Inspection, regular inspection, especially incoming inspection. Incoming inspection for store products. If you're running a warehouse or a processor or a retail store, you want to look at what comes in. That is what is basically the exclusion step. We talk about exclusion for rodents as being sealing holes in the walls, gaps in their doors. What we're doing for the store product pests is the inspection of the incoming product is the exclusion stage for your management program. And finally, one of the most important things you can do is first in, first out. I cannot tell you how many times I've gone into a situation. I had one situation years ago. We were trying to find a cigarette beetle infestation. We could not. We tore the place apart. We were outside digging in the soil, looking around. We were tracing product through truck trailers around the country. And it turns out we found a couple of bags of old product that had been placed behind in an area that they weren't seen, and they were there for a couple of years. And those two bags were the whole source of the infestation. When I go into a warehouse, I look at the tops of the racks. If I'm looking for the famous not in inventory products, the products that have been taken out of inventory, the products that are out of spec, and you're not going to use them, but you don't want to throw them out. So you put them in the back corner somewhere, and they sit there for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and they become infested and are the source of the infestation. So it's first in, first out, and get rid of product that you're not going to use, but make sure you rotate this product. Retail stores, we know that we have more infestation in some of the larger package sizes, because in some cases those move much slower than the smaller package sizes, and they can become infested. Unusual products, specialty products can become infested because they sit there for a longer period of time. So again, first in, first out is absolutely critical in managing a pest food store product pest situation. Now, I'm going to turn back over to Jared.
All right, thank you, Jeff. All right. So what are some of the things that you can do? Sanitation, as Jeff touched on earlier, is paramount. So whether it's spilled grain or flour behind equipment or even inside of equipment, we've seen like mixers in a bakery where they put flour and stuff in, and then flour spills out, gets on the floor, and gets in every crack and nook and cranny in this mixer, and it is harboring beetles, and I mean, you name it, it can harbor it inside the machine itself. So keeping all those areas clean, removing anything that they can possibly feed on or breed in is paramount. Reduce and repair gaps indoors. So as Jeff talked about, the warehouse beetle is commonly known to fly into warehouses, as well as the Indian meal moth. So I can think of times where I have set pheromone traps next to a door just to see what was coming in, and was surprised at how many Indian meal moths were entering a warehouse through that door. So it's important to think about that as well, not just for keeping mice and larger pests out, but also keeping your stored product pests out. And then also, like Jeff mentioned as well, keeping or inspecting the incoming goods for stored product pest activity. Then one of the best ways to keep them out of your facility is to inspect things that are coming in and rejecting them if they are infested, or putting them out in a container or a trailer somewhere off site, or out of the building where they can then be treated. And then also rotating the stock. It is important. The stuff that's been sitting there a long time. Jeff and I have both seen many circumstances like that where a bin of something is sitting in the back of the warehouse, been there for 2 years, and that is the source of the entire infestation. So those things are really important to keep in mind. Just some things that you can do on your own to help reduce or eliminate stored product pest infestations. All right. So what are some of our service offerings? Jeff touched briefly on mating disruption. And yeah, that is an option, especially for organic facilities. It is a non-toxic treatment for usually the moths, like the Indian meal moths, that really just uses the insect biology against them to gain control. Pheromone monitoring, again, extremely important. Grocery stores, warehouses, really anywhere that you can set up pheromone monitors gives us an idea of what is happening before the infestation gets bad. And many times also leads us, like we can use pheromone monitoring to help track down the source of an infestation by putting them like strategically in a store, or bulk food section in a grocery store, or out in a warehouse or something like that. We can actually help identify where the source of the infestation may be coming from. Inspection services. So we can come in and inspect your facility, look in those cracks and under the racks and the gondolas, and behind bins, and help you identify if you have an ongoing infestation, or even just looking for ways to prevent one in the future. Fogging, which is so coming in with like a pyrethroid product, something just as a knockdown. It is good for getting sometimes like a growth regulator out into the space to help prevent, break the life cycle of the insects and keep them from breeding. IGR treatments, which I just mentioned there, a lot of times they're done through fogging, sometimes through crack and crevice, sometimes mixed with an adulticide, sometimes just done on their own. So dusting of bins and storage areas, and a lot of times this is done with like diatomaceous earth. And we have done that many times with in grain, in empty bins, empty spaces where we have access and can dust. That can be a very effective way of eliminating insects as well. We have our online electronic reporting, which I'll touch on a little bit more here in a minute. But that's a great tool for you to let us know sometimes what's going on. You can view trends. You can do, look at, and by looking at trends, know what time of year we typically see spikes in activity. Things like that can help not only you, but it can help us as well. And then fumigation. So fumigation is a pretty common way to eliminate stored product pests. Use it a lot in seed and flour, grain, and it is one of the most effective ways of completely eliminating, but it doesn't always 100% eliminate the problem either. All right, and what are some of the results of effective control program? Reducing fumigation. So when we talked about the mating disruption, when we started mating disruption, gosh, Jeff, I don't remember how many years ago exactly, but it was quite a while ago. We have some clients that we used to fumigate on a annual or maybe even 3 times a year. We'd fumigate their facilities to reduce Indian meal moths. And with mating disruption, we've in many cases eliminated those fumigations, but have definitely reduced them across the board. Reduced pesticide use, reduced loss of product, and that's huge. When you're throwing product away, it's money out the door, and by having an effective control program, you can reduce that loss as well. And then happier clients. When you are not shipping out product that is infested with stored product pests, your clients are generally going to be happier, and you're going to be happier about that as well. All right, as I mentioned before, some of our online reporting options. So we have a customer portal, which it allows you to go on there. You have a unique login. It's just for you. You can request services. You can, pay your bills online. You can create your own custom trend reports and alerts, so you know what's going on at all times. So when your service technician comes out and completes a service, within hours of him, if not sooner, completing the service, you can go on there and see what, you can start viewing trends and see what's going on, see what he found. So there's a lot of advantages to the customer portal for you. The online logbook. So this is your auditing compliance tool. This was created specifically for third-party auditors. It has your service records, licenses, any material info in SDS, and then your servicing technician, all their licenses or picture. So it's got a lot of information there that's just for your third-party auditors. But it is easily accessible on almost any platform, as well as a portal. You can access it off of your smartphone or your laptop or your desktop or whatever. So these are very very accessible, readily accessible for you. You even have the option of downloading your online logbook. So in case you're worried about losing internet service, you can download a copy of that, then be prepared and ready for an audit at any time. All right, and with that, we're at the questions.
I've had a couple questions here that I answered. I typed in the answer. I don't know if that went to the people who asked it, but the first question was, what is a pheromone? And a pheromone is basically an odorous substance produced by an insect that attracts members of the same species. You might think of it as a sex attractant, our pheromones. They are generally produced by the most powerful ones, like for the Indian meal moth, the cigarette beetle, and the warehouse beetle, are produced by the male and attract the females. Produced by a female, attract the males into the trap. So it makes it very good because by only attracting males to the trap, they can't start infestations because you're not bringing egg-laying adults into the facility. The second question was, when cleaning, dust spillage, and equipment pallet racking, was recommended methane, soaps, alcohols, vacuum? We recommend vacuuming primarily, or sweeping is actually really good. Compressed air is the one thing you don't want to use, because compressed air will scatter eggs and adult insects around the facility. Generally, in a dusty environment, soaps and alcohols, I really wouldn't use liquids to clean a dusty environment. That might cause other issues. Next question was, what is an IGR? And an IGR is an acronym for insect growth regulator. And what that is a synthetic version of an insect hormone that disrupts their life cycle, preventing population growth. So basically there's a couple ones, but the most important ones, insects shed their skins or molt to go from one stage to another. And what these hormones do is they disrupt that molting process, so insects can't complete their natural development. So it doesn't kill anything directly, but it keeps the insects from developing. Another question, what do you recommend for products already infested with storage with Indian meal moth? One Indian meal moth can lay up to 400 eggs, difficult to manage. So inside the bins, now Indian meal moths, I'm in the bin situation, they generally only infest the top layers of what's inside the bin. So, they're not going to be, if they're coming in the top of the bin, they're not going to be all the way through the mass of the grain. So in some cases, you can scoop out that grain, the top part of the grain or whatever stored in there, and and save what's underneath it. To treat with them, we do a lot of dusting of the inside of the bins with diatomaceous earth products. There are several labeled pesticides that can be used in that situation. There are also, in the bins empty, you can spray the inside of the bins with some insecticides, properly labeled insecticides to deal with that. Generally, you want to get in there. The best way is to clean out all that webbing out of there. The challenge, if you don't clean the webbing out, no matter what you put in there as an insecticide, the webbing will prevent it from contacting the insect. So cleaning that thing out is the real key. And then doing a dusting of the bin. You can top dress the product in there in some cases, depending on the labeling. You can do all types of things to deal with those Indian meal moths. But remember, Indian meal moths, like the weevils and some of the other lesser grain borers and rice weevils, they can penetrate the whole mass of the grain. It'll be consistent throughout the mass of the grain. Indian meal moths, almost always only limited to the top layers of this grain in a storage bin situation. Now, if you have a different situation, they may be deeper in it. Any other questions? Well, thank you. It was enjoyable doing this presentation. I always like talking about this. Part per million is to kill an Indian meal moth while fumigating. That depends on the fumigant. Phosphine, you follow the label directions for the amount of product you put in. They don't really go by parts per million generally. Generally, we shoot depending on what product you're using, you can go anywhere from 250 parts per million to 800,000 parts per million. But it's a concentration time situation. You really want to look at each situation differently. But if you follow the label, using the amount of product they recommend for the amount of time they recommend, you will you'll move forward. How do you choose an IPM directed pest company? Well, you want to ask hopefully we've taught you something today that you can ask the questions. Do you use these different techniques? Because IPM is integrated pest management, means using more than one technique. An IPM company is not going to go in there and just say, well, we'll just spray or we'll just fumigate. I mean, some of the companies, like fumigation companies, do have their place. If you need a fumigation, you might have to hire a company to fumigate. But if you want to develop a program to manage their whole facility, you want to look at companies that understand and know how to use and integrate different methods together, because it's a stacking the effects. It's a whole, anything in pest control is what I call stacking the effects, where no one tool generally solves a problem. You have to use multiple tools to get at a problem, and it's very, very important to do that.